Hello, Sober on Purpose family. I have a guest with me, and we're going to talk about a little bit of a touchy subject. So if you've got children with you, I'm warning you ahead of time. We are going to talk about sexual addiction. He is part of the Prodigals of Alaska. So he's up in Alaska. This is Logan Hufford, and he is married to a wonderful, beautiful woman named Carrie, and they are raising 4 little monkeys. And he said, as we were talking before, that he is in birthday season. So this is a tough season for 4 little monkeys. And Logan has really made it a mission to share about his journey through sexual addiction. He's running some recovery groups, and he's also paired that with some financial recovery with the Dave Ramsey program. So, Logan, welcome. So glad you're here with us on Sober on Purpose.
Thank you so much for having me. It's seriously an honor to be here.
I'm thrilled that you're here. This is something that is more and more surfacing in the world of recovery, of an issue that often is buried underneath some other addictions. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about your story and how all of this unfolded for you.
Absolutely. So, one thing that is, as I look back on my story, as I look back on my my life, starting literally as a little kid, going till now, is there's something kind of unique about my story in that it's incredibly boring. And what I mean by that is, like, I've gotten to hear so many stories from men and some women. In most of these stories, the vast majority in addiction, the origin stories of their childhood is riddled with trauma. It's riddled with abuse. It's broken homes. It's complete lack of safety, right? And I don't say these words lightly at all. When I think about my childhood, there was never a day where I felt unsafe in my home. I was raised by both parents as the baby of 5. No family's perfect. We weren't perfect, but I always felt loved. Going to church every Sunday. My family practiced was what they preached. It wasn't just a cultural thing. Like we were taught the Bible. We had conversations with each other, and still very close with my siblings to this day. And yet I didn't need a push from trauma. I didn't need a push from abuse or a specific event for me to seek out the high of sexual addiction. And you touched on it before we started recording. I mean, it absolutely is a high, just like I would get from a drug. And part of my story is the progression of addiction, the progression going from still photos to then videos, to then even worse videos, to then eventually acting out with physical humans, with women, and even hiring prostitutes, and affair after affair when I was before and after and during my marriage. And to say I did things that I never thought I would do is a complete understatement. I became the absolute worst kind of person that I could imagine, and that's where I went, because I gave myself addiction.
Walk us back through, and in our culture, and in the American culture, we have the boys will be boys. There are images, there are things, and even our advertising has gone into soft porn, really. So walk us back through the still images and how that came about in your childhood.
Yeah, so especially given what I shared about how I grew up in the home that I grew up in. I mean, you best believe there was no Playboys laying around. There wasn't stuff like that. It was very hard for me to access, for the most part, anything that we would consider porn. What I started with was literally the JCPenney catalog, like once or twice a year, that giant catalog, and I would find the lingerie. I learned that, there's a part in there where there's women wearing very little clothing, and I like how I feel when I see those women. So the lingerie and the swimwear parts. And I didn't know about sex. I didn't know about masturbation. I didn't know even what to do with these feelings. I just knew that I liked how I felt. I got this rush, my heartbeat would go up, and I got this rush, and I liked that. And then, and this is like age 9. I don't remember the exact age, but it was around there. It's pre-adolescent. And shortly after that, maybe 10, I started, again, very rarely when I could, a couple times a year, or a couple times during that year or so, I got on the computer and looked at still photos. And one thing that really stands out to me there, and I've always remembered this very distinctly, I always looked for those two things, that I had trained my brain that this would give me a hit: bikinis and lingerie. And I was flicking through still photos. Again, didn't have any physical thing that I was doing with it, didn't know how to do that. And I saw a naked woman. And I remember immediately like going past that. I was, ooh, that's weird. That's weird. That's gross. Because I hadn't yet trained my brain that would give me a hit.
Dig a little deeper. That's an interesting space for the audience. Dig a little deeper on, that's gross, I don't like that, but I like this. How did that really come about?
I mean, any sort of analysis is completely, me thinking about it now. I don't remember thinking about why that was gross or anything like that in the moment. But ultimately, my addiction, though it had started, had not progressed enough to where that was an attractive thing. And I want to be sensitive to your audience, so I'll try to be really careful how I say this. There were types of pornography that I got into as I got older that I would not have watched before. It was violent because it's the stuff that was in it. And I'm not here to say that any kind of porn is okay, but in terms of the level of depravity increased the further I went. And so this was an early version of that. But like, I looked at stuff when I was 20 that I would not have wanted to look at when I was 14.
So you mentioned it earlier. It's very much like, I come home and I have a beer and I relax, or I have a glass of wine with dinner, and then that's not working anymore. And then I have 2 glasses, and then that's not working. So maybe I smoke a little something, or maybe I use a little something. And this goes with my theory that it isn't about what you're using to mood alter or to numb out. It is what is happening in your body, or like you've described the hit. So can you describe the feelings of the hit as you began to really progress? What was happening, and what were you needing at that point?
Yeah. No, and you're right. It was, so I'm a big believer in every decision I make trains my body and trains my brain that this is a good decision. Every choice I make, there's levels to that. I go get a coffee. I take a sip of my coffee. I'm training my brain that in that moment, this is a good thing for me. Now we'll leave that addiction aside. But literally, like and so I try to drink a lot of water. I train my brain that water is a good thing for me. It's something I've been really intentional about the last few years. Going back to addiction, so if I've gotten in the habit of training my brain that when I want pleasure, or when I want the best kind of pleasure, well, the thing I should do is to feel that sexual feeling that I've found in other ways. And then, as you alluded to with alcohol or drugs, okay, I need something more. I need something a little dicier. I need something a little riskier. And it could manifest differently. It does manifest differently with different people. My mentor is somebody who, his story, he had decades and decades and decades of addiction. I mean, 40 years, 50 years of active addiction. He never physically had sexual contact with another woman in marriage, but he would be able to detail for you exactly how his addiction progressed. It didn't flower the same way that mine did, but it still progressed. It still matured. So, I mean, for me, it was, the physical feeling of, my pulse and my heartbeat accelerating, sometimes a little bit of like sweaty palms, is the nervous excitement. And I mean, because it got to the point when I started having sexual affairs, I mean, I knew. I don't know how familiar your audience might be with like the relapse cycle. I would encourage them. In fact, so you have the website for Prodigals Alaska. The relapse cycle on there. There's different relapse cycles, different versions of it. I love the relapse cycle on there because it gets pretty detailed, and there's nothing graphic in there at all, but it really breaks down the cycle of me going from stressed, I'm starting to think about stuff, then I do stuff, and then I'm feeling the shame and all. And so when I was in that cycle, when I was chasing after something, I'm waiting for a text back from this lady, or I made a comment and I'm waiting to see how she responds, or I'm planning to meet up with somebody and she hasn't shown up yet. I mean, in these moments, I had basically a grown up, in a bad way, a very grown up, even more perverted, even more depraved version of little 9-year-old Logan looking at those images.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I needed more. I needed more excitement. I needed something worse or harder or more intense to really get that same feeling. And so I just continued chasing, down.
And that, you've just nailed it. I have that. Let's pull that up. Let me see if I can pull that up.
One thing about the relapse cycle, we're going through it right now in the group that I lead on Monday nights with guys that are struggling with sexual addiction, is the relapse cycle. This is not the gospel. This can look different. Again, just like addictions can manifest differently with different guys. Exactly how I go through the relapse cycle, I might not go through the exact same stages or the exact same stations in the exact same order every time. I generally will follow that cycle. I generally will follow that track. But for one, how long it takes to go through that cycle completely differs. There were points in my story where I went through the cycle in terms of I'm feeling stressed or triggered, all the way to I act out and then I'm feeling shame. And it took 6 months for me to go through the cycle. There were other times where it took 6 minutes.
Yeah. So talk to us about, this is a really good piece. Talk to us about what you're feeling when you start the cycle, and then what you're doing as the cycle ends. Kind of walk us through it.
Yeah. So, on the bottom left of the screen there, we see stress. And I could also say triggered, not necessarily sexually triggered, but just I'm feeling something that I either is painful or I want to escape from, or just something that gets me going, you know what, I'd like to feel some pleasure. And withdrawal being the next step, coming along with secrecy. And this might be physically, I might physically like go into another room away from my wife, away from my kids, because there's a term we use, corrosion and cutoff. I am going to start corroding, kind of intentionally, kind of unintentionally, corroding my ties to reality, my ties to the things that God has given me in this earth that should make it completely ridiculous for me to ever cheat on my wife or look at pornography. So I start to corrode those things. And then I cut off and I'm withdrawing. I'm now in Logan's universe where it's all Logan and it's all about what Logan wants. And those babies in the next room, that beautiful wife in the next room, whatever it be, that doesn't matter right now. And then preoccupation, daydreaming, and the next one is planning, grooming. I throw that in right in there because it was kind of just a jumble. I'm thinking about what it would look like to get that pleasure, to get that hit. The one difference between, for me, preoccupation, daydreaming, and then the next one, which is planning, grooming. Preoccupation, daydreaming, for me was very internal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about things, I'm soaking in, I'm dwelling in something, a negative space. Planning and grooming is when it's still some internal stuff, but then it started to get external. Now I'm starting to, maybe I'm texting someone, or I'm setting something up, or I'm driving somewhere, or I'm going to sites that are not maybe pornographic, but they're not stuff I should be looking at. And I know better. I know what that's probably going to lead to. And then I'm acting out. Now I am chasing that hit. I am injecting myself with that drug. And, after that, I'll be honestly, reinforce. I was having trouble seeing it. So reinforcement, literally, that's biological, right? God made it so that we would have this incredible reinforcement when I have sexual intercourse with my wife, and I'm perverting that, right? And I'm feeling the hit because I acted out. Despair, fear, self pity, um, lived in despair. My life was just complete darkness for years.
So wait. You're getting this hit that you think you really want. You get it, and you end up in despair. What's
Yeah.
going on with that?
Again, not to be too graphic, but I mean, because once I acted out, once that high was over, it's like, oh my goodness, I did it again. I am the worst. I can, and it felt different if it was having sex with another woman versus pornography. I would be lying if I said it didn't feel a little bit different, but the despair was still there. It was more intense if I was with another woman, but it was there even if it was porn and there wasn't a physical woman there. Because either way, I'm lusting, I'm giving over to that, I'm giving over to my addiction. So yeah, the despair, I am the worst. I remember I've never been angry at God. I've never been, but I absolutely been like, why did you create me? Like you created me, and all I'm doing is hurting every single person that you put in my path. First and foremost, the woman that I'm supposed to be loving and serving and leading, and the kids that I'm supposed to be protecting. And that's you're introducing me. We're talking about my bio, and it is every time I think about my boys, and I don't mean this in a pity party. Or every time I think about my boys, I'm reminded of the miracle that recovery is.
Amen.
Because it's the complete opposite. It's the complete opposite of the despair that I felt because, oh my gosh, I have this incredible family, and yet I just abused them.
Well,
Where
and here, let's share this with the audience. It isn't the person who has moved into this level of addiction isn't out there going, woo woo, I'm having a great time. This is wonderful. I just want, there is the hit, there's the fix, which feels good for a little while. But as you're describing it, that doesn't carry into your life. In fact, it really makes your life worse
oh yeah,
of what's going on. It's not suddenly there's this misnomer that, oh, I'm out there having a great time and I really want to do this. No. No, when it's with addiction, it's the last thing you want to do, but the only thing that feels like how I've experienced it, the only thing that feels like it's keeping you alive.
yeah. For me, it wasn't honestly the last thing that you said. I know that that's a lot of people's experience it, and I completely I don't deny that at all. It honestly wasn't for me. It wasn't the thing that made me feel alive. It was quite literally, it was the thing that I had taught myself to do to feel the most intense pleasure.
Mhm.
And so it was, and I want to be very clear. I'm not giving myself the excuse. Yes, I was trapped in addiction, and yet I also still made my choices, and that is a really tricky thing for some people to understand. And I can dive into
Mhm.
that, but it's both things are true. I was trapped in
Mhm.
addiction. I also made my own choices.
Mhm.
So the tricky thing there, but yeah, it was just it was I'd completely trained. I mean, it's like if I've trained myself to do anything from a young age, and now I'm trying to get myself to not do that again, it's going to be extremely hard. Most things that we've trained ourselves to do from a young age are not sinful and destructive and evil. This was.
Let's walk back let's walk back into the young age. Grew up in a Christian household, youngest of 5. I'm going to assume nobody had a clue this was happening. You even got married. I'm going to assume that she didn't know. She didn't know all this was going on. How how, how did God bring this in front of you when you've been able to live this double life for so long?
So I'll touch briefly on the childhood stuff, but I really want to focus on the last thing you asked. So I I mean, the first thing that I did, I 100% was caught because I was like a 9-year-old looking at photos on. I didn't know how to cover my bases, and so I, that stuff got caught, and my parents were like, hey, this is really wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. And I don't know how they should have handled that. But we never did sit down and really talk through anything beyond like, okay, well, the Bible says don't lust, and that's lust, and we read a book called The Purity Principle, and we had a couple conversations, but that was it. One thing my parents never did was they never shared anything about their own experiences. They never shared anything about themselves. The word that comes to mind, and I don't say this, and I've talked to them about this since then. They were never vulnerable. They were never vulnerable about their own struggles in this area. And again, I had an incredible childhood. They did a fantastic job. But that was one thing that I do look back like, I do wish that they had done that. But again, I'm not blaming them.
Well, and truly, Logan, they probably didn't have the tools. I don't know
Right.
that parents now, even we did Passport to Purity with the boys. We did some other things. And it's if you know Mo Isom's book about pornography, she's a woman actually, and she writes a book called Church, Sex, and the Jesus, Church, and Sex, and the Conversation That the Church Forgot. I've gotten the title wrong, but we'll put it in the links.
Yeah.
And I
have another book, by the way.
Yeah.
Just
and
good pictures, bad pictures is a
oh,
fantastic book.
good. We'll put all those in the links.
Yeah.
And I was going to say that about your website, Prodigals of Alaska. There's a great book list for spouses on there too, which has some things that I haven't seen at all. So there are things out there, but I am sure your parents did the best they could with what they have,
Yeah.
which is what you're saying. But it's a continual conversation. As you're saying, at 8 and 9, there's this conversation. 11, 12, there's a different conversation. 15, 16, they don't want to hear you anymore. I had to pay my kiddo to read the book, and then there's another conversation. But like you said, this vulnerability piece is often not there. And there's covenant eyes for men, especially for men. There's not a lot of conversation about this. So how did God bring this? You're living this double life. You've done it with your folks. You're doing it with your wife. You've got kids on the way, I'm sure. How did you come to the point where you said enough is enough?
I just want to mention really quick. I love that you've brought up multiple times that phrase double life, because I don't think I've said that phrase this entire conversation. That is one of my most commonly used phrases when I'm talking recovery, because that is ultimately that's what it was for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was a complete double life. And newsflash, God did not create us to live double lives. He did not create us to live a secret life on the side. Like that is such a destructive thing. Even if somebody was an atheist, I'd be like, there is so much biology that backs that up. It's very destructive to try to compartmentalize half my life. But anyways, so you touched on, did my wife know? I shared with her that I struggled with pornography when we first started dating, and to that point, that was actually the accurate truth. To that point, I had never cheated on anyone in the past. My stuff had pretty much all been internal. I'd had some physical interactions with other women, but the infidelity in my mind had not occurred yet. Looking back, it totally had started. The seeds had started. But
let me stop you right there, because this is a hot debate. Is pornography infidelity? Is pornography a mistress? Where do you fall on that?
So this is like the third time that I'll say this phrase, but I mean it. I want to be careful with your audience, but I also won't hold back. It absolutely is. It absolutely is cheating, because when I'm looking at pornography, I'm masturbating pornography. Well, even when I'm not masturbating, if I'm looking at that, I'm fantasizing about that, I'm having sex with that woman in front of me, or I'm doing sexual things with that woman in front of me. And it is it's not, I'm not going to say that it's more dangerous. It does things, it opens doors that even having an affair doesn't necessarily do, because when I am addicted to pornography, when I'm using that drug of choice, I have all the power and control. I get to pick exactly who I want to see, who I want to be with, essentially. I get to choose and control how long do I look at them. When do I want to click on another thing? What type do I want them to be, intoxicated? I mean, just like I go through all these things, and I pick exactly how depraved the other person is and how depraved I am. It's a terrible, terrible thing.
That is as clear as I've heard it put, in that it's not a relationship. When you said the affair is somewhat less, we think of pornography as being less, but the affair requires another person. So you have to have some, how do we say this? You have to have some consent in there and connection, be it possibly little and not a whole lot of mental spiritual connection, but you have to
There's
have
relational equity in that, even if it's
That's
very twisted and
perfect.
perverted, but there's
Yeah.
relational equity, and there's none in pornography.
So there's no relational equity, and the other things on your site is technology addiction, phone addiction, or something like that. It's similar in the sense that there isn't any relationship. My phone and I,
Right.
in a sense, have a relationship. We kind of amorphize it, but we don't. It's not demanding anything of me. Whereas if there's another human, thank you for bringing that out. I'm sorry to pause you in the middle of that story, but I
No,
think
you're good.
a lot of people will say, oh, it's just pornography, it's just pot, it's just, he's there 70 hours a week, he's not there 80, 90, 120 hours a week, those types of things. It's just. So your wife knew that there were some issues with pornography. What did she do with that information?
So over the next basically 7 years, some dating, engaged, and then into marriage, I cheated on her for the first time before we got married, and then once that dam broke, boom, it was just this whole other progression, this whole other level of addiction, where now I still looked at porn, but I really wanted an affair. I really wanted to have a sexual encounter with another woman. And I started chasing after that. And again, it eventually progressed to prostitutes as well. And during those times, I confessed multiple times, starting a year after we were married. I confessed, hey, I had an affair. I did this terrible thing. And in that moment, I truly felt like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe I did that. That was terrible, but I'm not going to do it again because that was awful. Going back to that relapse cycle. There's one part of despair. On the bottom, it says false resolve, never again. And again, totally. And I might have felt that false resolve, never again. I might have felt it for a good few months, or it might have been a good few minutes before I did something else. But each time I confessed, I was thinking like, oh, I'm done now. At least early on, I felt like that. And then she was like, she didn't know what to do. She was like, oh, okay, well, I need to love him more. I need to be sexier. I need to make myself more sexually available. I need to submit. And these are her words. She would tell you, I need to submit and be a good wife. And I definitely don't want to like bring shame on our family. So we'll just try to like, we'll keep it between us. And she would tell you like that's how she responded initially, because she didn't know what the heck to do. And so in 2015, I had another affair, countless affairs throughout these years. And I know I jumped a lot because this is going from 2009 to 2015. We've got 3 boys now. She's pregnant with the 4th. And I had another affair. And she said, Logan, if you don't make serious changes, I will take our boys and I will be gone. And my wife is not a rash person. She's not overly emotional. She is not somebody that just says things. She doesn't give ultimatums. And I knew that she meant that. We both have family in the area. I knew that she would absolutely be able to be on her own and without me. And that scared me because I didn't want to lose that. I had long since given up the hope of ever having a relationship with Christ. But I didn't want to lose my relationship with her and the boys if I could help it. And it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows from there. It was basically another year of going in and out of addiction. I attended some groups, SAA, Sexually Addicted, or Sexual Addiction Anonymous, and then Celebrate Recovery. And, and it was actually at Celebrate Recovery that I met one other man who we were in a group of like 20 guys, mixed group, different substances, addictions, different things. And he and I were the only guys that said, I'm so-and-so and I'm here because I struggle with sexual addiction. And he pulled me aside and he's like, afterwards, he goes, hey, I really appreciate you here. If you really want help with this, you probably need more than this group. He said, I needed more than this group. And I kept him at arm's length. And at one point, I even asked him, I said, hey, Rick, I would love to maybe get together with you for coffee sometime, and we could talk about this. He is one of the most loving people I know. He is like a dad to me. He's Grandpa Rick to our boys. And he looked at me in that moment. He said, Logan, if you want to get together for coffee, I don't have to. And that hurt me. That was offensive to me. It's like, I'm putting myself out. I'm trying. And you're shutting me down. And then he quickly followed up. He's like, if you want to be serious and actually do what you need to do to work on this, I will be there for you and I will help you. But it's not going to be getting together for coffee once in a while. And he ended up walking with me very intensely for 2 years in basically voluntary house arrest recovery program that we did. And I mean, he's still one of my best friends and absolutely a father figure to me. But just one thing I want to touch on really quick. I know I've been rambling because from what I gather, I mean, your audience, it's a lot of women, and some of your audience maybe struggles with addiction issues, but then a lot of your audience probably has a loved one that struggles.
Yes. So the focus is on you're in a relationship with a loved one who is struggling with addiction. And that's, I think you're going to go here. That's what I want to go back to is you said your wife said, well, I need to be sexier. I need to be more sexually available. I need to be more submissive. I need to be this. But if I'm hearing you correctly, it had nothing to do with that.
Never.
I've heard say that again because I need the audience to hear it. Yep. That doesn't fix it. It is not about your partner.
It didn't fix anything. It didn't, because, and I've heard the stories of, a guy comes to the group and he's, 60 years old and, oh, our marriage has been full of resentment and she doesn't take care of herself and this, that, and the other. And okay, dude, like maybe, who knows? But I had no excuse. My wife did everything she could to be the perfect wife. Now, I'm not saying she was perfect, but she did everything she could. She was incredible. And I didn't cheat on her because I didn't love her. I didn't cheat on her because she wasn't attractive. I cheated on her because, again, like I mentioned earlier in the conversation, because Logan had trained himself that the best way to get the best kind of pleasure was through sexual addiction. And
so she couldn't compete with this. This started at 8 and 9. This was already instilled in you. And you've said this repeatedly this was how I hit my pleasure high. You didn't know how else to do that. There's nothing she could have done that would have created something different. And that's where the families that I work with are like, well, if I had done X, X, and X, then it would all be okay. No, this is a person who has to deal with themselves and their maker on what it is that is causing this desire.
And there's, with her, I want to make sure to highlight this because it's such an impactful, I mean, this is technically her story, but it's our story, is there's actually something that can be really hurtful to Carrie, is that when folks have heard our testimony, on occasion, somebody might come up to her, and I totally know where they're coming from. She understands where they're coming from, but somebody might come up to her and be like, it's so incredible that you stayed with Logan. And again, they mean well, right? That's coming from a good place. Yeah. But it's like, no. The incredible thing wasn't that she stayed with me. The incredible thing was that she chose to implement boundaries for the first time. That she chose to face her abuser. It doesn't, her abuser was her husband and those little monkeys' dad. But she chose to face her abuser and say, no, I'm done with you hurting me. If you hurt me again, we are gone. That's the incredible thing. Now, she did stay in the marriage. She didn't have to. I'm a Christian. I hate divorce. I don't want. She absolutely could have walked away, and that would have been totally within her rights.
And
But
in scripture, it's completely within her rights. Infidelity is
100%.
one of the few reasons for a divorce. What we need to do another episode. What you're bringing out is that it wasn't magical that she stuck around. In fact, she was harming you and the kids by not setting clearer boundaries. Earlier, you said she didn't know what to do, and that is a lot of the structure is, "This is not what I expected, I wasn't." She was probably raised in a household very similar to yours where there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about this. What do you do? And if you go to your pastor here, quite honestly, if you go to your pastor, you're probably not going to get a lot of help because it scares them too.
Yeah.
It would have to be a very enlightened person to be able to deal with that. That's why I think this podcast is so important, is where can you get help in a way that isn't going to, there could be really serious repercussions, loss of family, loss of job, loss of, friendships, people looking at you like you're an alien, when really, I mean, statistically, most men struggle with this. This is not an out of the ordinary. So I slowed you up there, but when people would approach her and say that, what would she give as her response?
So, literally, in terms of how many times that's happened, it's been a handful of times. So I couldn't accurately say, well, it's she's given this response a couple times. Usually, she's been very, very gracious and just I appreciate your love, basically. Because she understands where it's coming from. So I think it would be too extreme to say she's taken offense to it, but it is hurtful to her because it's a reminder of how she used to be, which was, I guess I'm not enough. I'll try to do better, instead of no more. If you do it again, we are gone. And it was this incredible mixture of, on one hand, she was strong. She stood up for her babies. She stood up for herself, not necessarily against me, but against my addiction. But then she also, and this is, I would love to come back and talk with you again. I can dive into this more. But she also completely surrendered any feelings of power and control over me and my addiction. Because I'll tell you another very common thing is, even if a couple is starting to work on things, a very natural thing is, well, the wife's an accountability partner now. And my worst accountability partner would be the person that I've abused and manipulated and lied to. And yet that happens. And we kind of sort of try to do that. And my mentor and her mentor, they're married, and they're like, no, that's not how we do things. And so she surrendered and submitted to God and to godly men, godly people that were put into my path, my mentor, the whole mentorship team. And the first time I went to this group, the Prodigals in Anchorage group, before we ever had one in the Valley out here, I sat down and I saw, there were about 20 guys in this group, all recovering sex addicts, or all guys that on some level struggled. And there was like 8 guys that had 5, 10, 15, 20 years of recovery, of transformed lives. And I'm not exaggerating. I did not think that was possible. When I did the things that I did for as many years as I did them, I did not think it was possible to have any sort of a life of peace, of joy, of anything like that. Because I'd signed all that away, is what I thought.
Yeah. Hey, Logan, this has just been super powerful. And I really appreciate you being with the Sober on Purpose podcast today. I want to talk more about that very intricate dance of your marriage relationship, the healing process, and I want to do that in the next episode. So folks can find you. Where can we find you? Your website? What does that look like?
Absolutely. So there's going to be 2 different resources that I'll make sure you have, that you can put in the show notes. As I alluded to earlier, anonymity is huge with this, right? Because there's so much shame that I felt. There's shame that my wife felt, that Carrie felt. And so folks can anonymously reach out to us. We have an email that goes only to me and Carrie. So if a man or a woman has questions, they can reach out. So you'll be able to put that in the show notes. And then there's also, the website for Chronicles of Alaska. And there's part of me that I almost don't love giving out resources sometimes, because at the end of the day, like, tools are just tools. The best gym and equipment in the world doesn't get me in shape. Me actually using it with an intent on getting in shape, that's what does, right? But tools are helpful. Marsha Means is an incredible author for women that have been hurt and betrayed in this way. And some of her books are on that reading list on the website. And I'll just say Doug Weiss is an incredible author for men who are struggling with sexual addiction. But there's a full reading list on there, as well as some other tools like the relapse cycle that we talked about. And if people have questions on those tools, feel free to let us know in an email as well.
Awesome. The last thing I want to point out is there's a sexual addiction checklist. So if you're just curious, if you're really struggling, you can walk into that checklist. It's like any other checklist. If you check a lot, it's just self-evaluative, and you can begin to make some decisions around that. So Logan, you've been super vulnerable. Really appreciate you being here. We'll put all those things below, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation, which is going to center around the marriage covenant, how Christ came into this, how you began to really say, I'm valuable and I can change. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.